Mythical creatures have haunted us for eons. Stories of ogres, werewolves, dragons, yetis, giants, and other terrifying creatures lurk in every culture and across all recorded time. Even though societies rise and fall, it seems the tales of otherworldly creatures are harder to kill. One such creature is said to stalk the night, seeking any unfortunate souls upon which to feed, each victim providing the creature's immortal body with a dark sacrifice of blood. I am speaking, of course, of the vampire, a kind of undead leech, a species nearly indistinguishable from human, save for its cold, pale skin and enlarged canines. For hundreds of years, and perhaps even longer, people have lived in fear of these mythical shape-shifting monsters, or alternatively have been perversely fascinated by them. However incredible it may sound, I posit, dear listener, that vampires are not only based on truth, but walk among us even today. Indeed, they are real, and now I present the culmination of years of research into vampire lore, biology, anatomy, physiology, and behavior. For this brief time together, I ask you to lend me your ear as we dive deep into the disturbing biological reality of the vampire. There is likely no discernible patient zero when it comes to the disease of vampirism. When asked, historians and theologians may point to Lilith or Lilitu, a figure in both Hebrew and Babylonian mythology. In both stories, nocturnal sanguivary or blood-eating is a common thread. As previously mentioned, the concept of the vampire is present in cultures around the world. The Strigoi in Romania, the Manananggal of the Philippines, the Yangtze of China, and the Caribbean Sukuyant. These monsters differ in many ways, but they share one common trait, a thirst for human blood. But it was the legends of 12th century Europe that truly cemented our modern conception of the vampire. It was this era that gave us many of the superstitions and traits we associate with vampires even today. Though, of course, Stoker's Dracula and Renault's Nosferatu have been arguably even more influential in the modern era. Like many of you, for years I considered these myths of nocturnal, blood-sucking creatures to be nothing more than primitive fantasy, relics of bygone religions and the products of overactive imaginations. But then, many years ago, I was confronted with something I couldn't explain. A dear friend and colleague was attacked by cover of night. Her blood drained from 2 small pricks in her neck, seemingly as she slept in her bed. It's curious how the mind connects seemingly disparate moments across time. Indeed, it wasn't until I began to seek specimens for study that I found myself suddenly transported back to that frigid laboratory in the Urals years ago. Among the abandoned equipment and scattered notes, I recalled the glimpse of a skull with pronounced eye teeth displayed almost unceremoniously on a shelf. I dismissed it then as a mere anatomical anomaly. How often our earlier selves miss what later becomes so obvious. Since the time of Dr. Foster's death, I sought her killer and stumbled upon a truth purposefully hidden for millennia. And though I haven't yet filled in all the gaps, I now believe that I have enough evidence to draw a conclusion. Vampires are not supernatural beings as the stories tell. They are as real as you or I, but as the result of a mutagenic virus, they possess abilities that I am only beginning to comprehend. I hope that you'll withhold your judgment as to my level of sanity for just a few moments longer. I will present to you now the findings it's taken me decades to compile, and thanks to some new colleagues, much of these findings are taken from first-hand observation and dissection. But before we can discuss the details of these creatures' design, we must first understand how their condition spreads. Contrary to popular thought, it is not a supernatural imbuing of life force nor a selling of one's soul to the devil that causes the dark transformation into a vampire. It is, in fact, a lowly virus, transmitted through bodily fluids, a mononegavirus with properties similar to rabies, mumps, and measles. Unlike most others, this insidious virus infects its host cells via endocytosis, or full absorption rather than a more aggressive injection into the cell, or outright cell destruction via lysis. Not content to target a single tissue type as other viruses do, the human vampiric virus, or HVV as I've come to call it, infects every living cell within the human body, with the exception of red blood cells. This alone is frightening, but it doesn't stop there. HVV appears to alter its host cells in a uniquely insidious manner, allowing them to continue normal processes such as regenerating their membranes, while also hijacking them in order to produce its own viral clones. In short, while cells are infected and altered, they are not destroyed. a trait that makes the virus immensely successful. Adding to this success is a staggeringly rapid replication cycle. Infection of the thyroid gland initially increases the speed of metabolic processes throughout the body, and the virus's incubation period is a nearly unprecedentedly brief 6 to 12 hours. Once incubation is complete, victims of HVV begin to manifest an array of symptoms not unlike the common flu: headache, fever, and chills, as well as the effects of the aforementioned metabolic increase. Rapid heart rate, severe thirst, excessive sweating, and frequent urination have all been observed. These symptoms generally last another 6 to 12 hours, but while these particular effects are disturbing, they are by no means unique to HVV. 12 to 24 hours after these symptoms first appear, however, the victim will slip into what I term a vampiric coma, and it is this state of active unconsciousness that begins the true transformation. If the victim lives through this extraordinarily taxing process, they will awaken an entirely different creature. In my observations, the vampiric coma typically lasts about a day, and the victim almost universally awakens at night. The coma itself is certainly not a peaceful slumber. The victim appears to be in a state of unconscious agony. It's little wonder why this is. The body undergoes numerous anatomical and physiological changes in a very short amount of time. Based on my own observations, pulse and breathing become erratic, the pupils dilate, the skin sweats profusely, and significant weight is lost. Toward the end of the coma, the victim appears to be calm, and it could be mistaken for dead. In fact, there's little doubt that some unfortunate victims have been prematurely buried this way, but the victim doesn't always survive the vampiric coma. In elderly and very young victims, mortality is very high, with a majority of survivors being aged between 18 and 35 years. Many outside this range simply never wake up. For those that do survive, however, the changes are unmistakable. Victims often undergo a kind of acclimation period characterized by confusion and paranoia, along with the physical effects of thirst and malnutrition. But this state doesn't last long. Within a day, the first signs of sanguivore manifest, and these newly transformed vampires are a danger to anyone close to them. The mutagenic changes wrought by this pernicious virus are largely complete within a week, and by then the virus enters a dormancy, only to be reawakened by severe stress or injury, or when it has entered the bloodstream of a new victim. By now, you're probably wondering just what these changes are. We will now move on to that exact subject, and I thank you for listening this far. Though the exact mechanisms are as yet unknown to me, I believe that the virus works, in essence, by a process known as horizontal gene transfer. This bears a troubling resemblance to other specimens I've documented over the years. Different manifestations, but a recurring signature that nonetheless suggests a common source or methodology. Of course, these phenomena aren't unheard of in nature. For example, the genes that facilitate stinger growth in certain cnidarians appears to have been incorporated from the genome of a foreign bacteria. What is clear, even to the outside observer, is that by the end of their transformation, vampires exhibit elongated, gracile extremities, extended mandibles, and numerous other anatomical and physiological changes. Some of the less obvious changes, at least to the outside observer, occur in the vampiric brain. There appears to be a reduction in serotonin levels, which would normally temper urges. Several pathways associated with dopamine and endorphin release are strengthened, specifically in response to feeding. For this reason, for the vampire, drinking blood is an intensely pleasurable act. Circadian rhythms are also reversed in vampires to allow for their newly nocturnal biology. But that's only the tip of this proverbial iceberg. The vampire amygdala is hypertrophied, roughly 7% larger than in the uninfected, and the visual cortex is a staggering 13% larger. Thick interconnections between the anterior cingulate gyrus and the rest of the brain are much lower than normal, almost as if the core of the brain is being isolated from the neocortex. Furthermore, the corpus callosum is 20% larger in vampires than in humans, resulting in a near instantaneous communication between the hemispheres. Finally, interneuronal density and cortical folding and lamination far exceed normal parameters, particularly in the visual cortex. In short, vampires are omnisavants, with pattern recognition abilities and intelligence far beyond ordinary human capabilities. The enlarged amygdala also seems to facilitate a vampire's level of perception, one that borders on precognition. On the other hand, likely partly because of this, vampires are much more prone to obsessive habits such as rearranging and counting objects. Additionally, vampire motor nerve axons are nearly twice as thick as a normal human's, resulting in lightning-fast reflexes. Paired with their extraordinary perception, it's no wonder why our ancestors conferred supernatural powers on the infected. Upon awakening from their coma, the vampire's pupils are visibly hyperdilated to the point where even the irises appear almost entirely black. And yet, increased reflectivity causes the irises to shimmer even in faint light, similar to the tapetum lucidum found in many nocturnal animals. In my testing, I've also determined that vampires possess quadrochromatic vision. While we humans only have 3 types of cone in our eye, vampires have 4, with this 4th being tuned to near infrared. All of this gives the vampire vastly superior night vision, though at the cost of severe sensitivity to light. This seems as good a time as any to bring up a common myth surrounding vampires: a severe aversion to crucifixes. Since ancient times, vampires have been thought of as a kind of evil spirit, a concept solidified in the Middle Ages. Of course, the greatest threat to any dark entity is the cross of Christ. But as we've seen, the vampire condition is not supernatural. Is there any legitimacy to this bit of lore? Let me explain with a bit of context. Our eyes contain arrays of specialized receptor cells. Some only activate when they see light and shadow in conjunction. Some activate only when they see horizontal lines, like horizons and so on. In vampires, the receptors that respond to horizontal lines are cross-wired with those that respond to vertical ones. When both sets of receptors are fired simultaneously in a very specific way, that is, when intersecting right angles occupy more than 30 degrees of visual arc, positive feedback seems to generate a neuroelectric overload in the visual cortex. This overload can lead to violent seizures, though in my testing only in specific situations. When the virus first appeared, likely millennia ago, this glitch caused few problems for vampires. After all, right angles seldom appear in nature, and Euclidean architecture was millennia in the future. It seems probable that once humans began constructing buildings, vampires found it difficult to cope. With humans virtually entirely protected by simple geometry, it's possible that the vampiric plague went into remission. In more modern times, however, I believe that HVV is making a resurgence. How is this possible given the modern ubiquity of right angles? Again, I must reference my own testing. It appears that vampires have developed the ability to selectively focus, keeping certain elements in the background of their vision. Right angles only presented a visual overload when it was thrust into their direct forward field of vision, and even then only in well-lit conditions. In short, the so-called crucifix glitch is no myth. Of course, vampires' heightened senses aren't only limited to sight. Hypertrophic cerebral neurons and additional receptor cells dramatically increase hearing range, and the same is true of smell. Unfortunately for their human victims, hiding from a vampire is nearly impossible. Some of the more impressive changes, however, occur in the more visible aspects of vampire anatomy. For one, muscular composition is drastically altered during the vampiric coma. Human muscles are made up of 2 main types of fiber, fast twitch and slow twitch, at a ratio of about 50-50. In vampires, an astounding 90% of their fibers are the fast twitch variety. This, along with the significant increase in myoglobin and mitochondria, which allows for a greater amount of activity without lactic acid buildup, and elevated intracellular ATP, means that vampires are not only frighteningly fast and strong, they are nearly inexhaustible. Interestingly, the heart is one muscle that is not strengthened after the change. It is, in fact, the exact opposite. The vampire's circulatory system undergoes a complete inversion as the heart ceases to beat. Instead, blood is pumped via the contraction of skeletal muscle, and the heart eventually atrophies from disuse. While at rest, involuntary spasms known as vesiculations take place in the limbs and emanate from the furthest extremities inward, similar to the wave-like peristalsis of the gastrointestinal tract. As a result, hand tremors can be a dead giveaway for a disguised vampire. But along with their teeth, one of the most obvious indicators of vampiric infection is their skin. Around 3 days after awakening from their coma, blood circulation begins to slow, especially in the epidermal capillaries. At the same time, capillaries in the core begin to proliferate, drawing blood away from the skin and into the trunk, giving vampires their signature sickly and almost ghostly pallor. Thinner areas of the skin, such as the eye sockets, lids, and lips, are the first to be affected by these changes. Vampires will often cover as much skin as possible with clothing and apply thick makeup to the rest. Now the time has come to speak of arguably the most disturbing aspect of vampire biology, the diet of blood. Digestion begins in the mouth, as they say, and vampires aren't so different. In most other respects, however, they are much more similar to the vampire bat, an animal whose insect parasites, I hypothesize, may have been the original source of the virus. But of course we can go no further without discussing the vampire's characteristic teeth. Both the upper and lower eye teeth experience extremely rapid growth. Produced inside the pulp, it appears that specialized ameloblasts travel through the narrow pores of the dentin and crown, and upon reaching the surface will deposit additional enamel onto its tip, creating a sharp fang. As a vampire ages, fluid loss causes a notable recession of the gums, making the teeth appear even longer. This process bestows the iconic enlarged canines upon its hosts, but they're certainly not just for show. Upon locating a slumbering victim, vampires will use their sharp canines to make an incision in the skin, ideally over a major vessel. Believe it or not, their saliva contains an anticoagulant called draculin, a glycoprotein also found in the saliva of vampire bats. Once blood is flowing freely, they begin to feed using a groove in their tongue as a kind of siphon. An additional salivary constituent causes an anesthetic effect in the victim, keeping them inert until blood loss overcomes them. At this point, you're probably wondering how a human-adjacent being can subsist solely on blood. For that matter, what benefit could eating blood have for a previously human organism? I will attempt to address these very valid questions. First, I have discovered that a side effect of the virus is the loss of the ability to synthesize PCDH-Y, a protein responsible for certain aspects of central nervous system development. Since this protein only occurs in hominids, human prey is an essential component of the vampire diet. Without it, they are unable to sustain their enhanced nervous systems, which causes a loop of viral reactivation from which there is no recovery. The ability to extract PCDH-Y from human blood is a hallmark ability of vampiric digestion, but there is much more. It goes without saying that blood is not a viable food source for an ordinary human. To adapt to this need, vampires undergo severe and drastic changes to both the form and function of their digestive system. For one, the entire system is reduced in vampires. The stomach atrophies and large portions of the intestines are shortened. Most impressive to me, however, is the alteration of the microbiome of the gut. Over a period of years, though the exact number is as yet unknown to me, the gut becomes host to a variety of immune-supporting bacteria, a kind of symbiosis that is facilitated, I believe, by the changes to the vampire genome resulting from the HVV virus. This, paired with what appears to be an enhanced resistance to prionic diseases, makes the vampire virtually immune to bloodborne diseases and bacteria. Additionally, the vampire digestive system is able to assimilate the high levels of iron found in blood and is able to process its high levels of nitrogen waste. But then there is the problem of volume. Human bodies generally contain about 5 to 6 liters of blood, while the vampire stomach holds only about 1.5 liters. As a result, the popular notion of a vampire draining a victim of all his or her blood is functionally impossible, unless the feeding takes place over several hours. And in fact, this is exactly what occurs, but not only because of limited stomach capacity. In order to cope with the excess nitrogen, vampires must take frequent breaks to urinate. Furthermore, the resulting urine gives off an extremely pungent, ammonia-based odor. At this point, we've discussed much of the changes that occur during the transformation from human into vampire. But you may have picked up on another fundamental problem. If the virus is transmitted via body fluid, and if vampires prey on humans, then it would stand to reason that eventually humans would be eradicated, leaving vampires with no remaining food source. Paradoxically, it is the virus's inability to infect certain humans that has led to its continued existence. Through some unconventional testing methods, I have determined that a significant portion of the population, though more testing will be necessary to determine just how significant, is effectively immune to HVV. These immune hosts will produce antibodies as soon as they start showing symptoms, whereas normally it can take days or weeks to produce antibodies for a new infection. The one exception to this rule is natural antibodies, which are believed to be the result of microbes native to the body since birth. By default, this limits the spread of HVV. But even among those who are susceptible to the virus, vampires have a solution to the problem of overhunting. Tests indicate that vampires have elevated levels of leukocynin, a peptide partially responsible for inducing hibernation in animals like bears and squirrels. Indeed, vampires are able to enter a kind of suspended animation for extended periods of time, and though my own testing has yet to find the limits of this ability, I hypothesize that by awakening every few years only briefly to feed, a vampire could remain essentially dormant for hundreds of years. This extended hibernation not only allows the vampire to survive when resources are scarce or competition is fierce, it also gives their prey an opportunity to repopulate, and with a species as slow at reproducing as humans are, the longer the better. In fact, even when resources are plentiful, this hibernation period may be required, as the transfer of food energy between trophic levels is very inefficient. But even with the ability to hibernate, how is it possible for vampires to live for so long? Hundreds of years in some purported cases. It appears that vampires are able to ward off the DNA damage that occurs during cell division in normal humans. In humans, the protective caps on the end of chromosomes, known as telomeres, degrade over time, but not in vampires. This is due to an increased production of telomerase, an enzyme that adds DNA sequence repeats. In addition, it appears that higher levels of the antioxidant enzyme catalase protect the cells from free radicals and ambient radiation, preventing oxidative and ionization damage to the DNA. In short, it seems that vampire physiology is virtually immune to the damaging effects that lead to aging. If you've stuck with me this long, your mind is likely filled with questions, perhaps related to common perceptions of vampires found in the media, namely whether vampires combust when exposed to sunlight, or are repelled by garlic, are able to shapeshift, do not reflect in mirrors, or cannot enter a house uninvited. In the interest of time, I will summarize briefly. None of these are true of vampires. They are likely derived from a grain of truth, but being passed down through the centuries, the reality has become distorted. Sensory sensitivity to light became deadly. Superior reflexes became flight, or the ability to turn into a bat. The ability to blend into the shadows via crypsis became non-reflectivity, and an aversion to right angles became the inability to cross the threshold of a home. The garlic thing is pure fiction. And so, my dear listener, I must thank you once again for listening to my findings thus far. Indeed, everything I've said is true. The vampiric virus is very real, and its effects are equal parts fascinating and terrifying. I do not know how many times throughout history this virus has surged and receded like a bloody tide, but I believe that without mainstream support for my research, humanity risks being pulled beneath the waves. I implore you, if you are able, to open your eyes and observe the insidious plague that has stalked us for eons. You may be able to avoid it for a time, but be assured, they walk among us. 12 years, I have been the sole pioneer in the study of diseases that most scientists would not deign to research. At best, they see my work as unpleasant. At worst, an affront to the scientific method. But I believe that my time of vindication is imminent, and my research into these little understood viruses will soon prove invaluable to all of humanity. In a previous volume, I presented the human vampiric virus, a disease which turns its victims into bloodthirsty revenants bent on destruction. But while the threat of HVV remains to this day, it isn't the only insidious pathogen I've discovered. Following is a summarized account of my work with an equally terrifying disease, which I have dubbed the human zombism virus, or HZV. Should this virus go unremedied, its flesh-hungry sufferers could pose a threat to humanity that may even surpass HVV. Now, permit me a moment to provide some context for my research. I humbly ask you to let your mind remain open to what follows. The future of our society may well depend on it. In my youth, an unrelated research project took me to the island of Hispaniola, and specifically to several rural regions throughout Haiti. It was there that I first learned of the legends of dead bodies that had been reanimated by voodoo magic, corpses pulled from their eternal slumber through an act of necromancy performed by a sorcerer called a bokor. Despite the prevalence of the accounts of so-called zombies, I was skeptical. Still, as legends are often based on some truth, my curiosity was piqued. Unfortunately, my time in that beautiful country was cut short as my unrelated research grant was abruptly terminated. I returned to America and observed with fascination as the zombie began to make appearances in Western media. Books such as Seabrook's The Magic Island and movies like Night of the Living Dead depicted them as shambling corpses single-mindedly intent on consuming brain matter. Then, only recently, my research into the human vampiric virus would once again bring me into contact with the zombie, not by magic as the legends told, but through an insidious infection that robs its victims of their humanity, transforming them into mindless, decaying shadows of their former selves. I hypothesized that the zombie plague is in fact caused by a virus from the order Mononegavirales, negative strand RNA viruses that cause Ebola, measles, rabies, and of course, vampirism. I have determined that HZV, or the human zombic virus, is a zoonotic virus, initially spread to humans by a lowly tick from the family Ixodidae. These ticks are found in great numbers in numerous tropical regions, including Haiti, where I suspect the virus may have originated. Tick-borne pathogens are certainly nothing new, but rarely are the diseases they spread so devastating to humans as HZV. Once bitten, the unfortunate victim will begin to undergo a kind of transformation, but the source of the infection isn't limited to ticks. For one, a tick may bite a rat, raccoon, or other animal, which in turn may pass the virus to humans, though a direct bite is certainly possible and in rural areas even likely. But the virus survives quite well apart from a host. I have personally tested freestanding water in which the virus survived for nearly 3 months. This ability makes HZV a major threat to water supplies, and though certain treatments can remedy this, this danger should not be ignored. Of course, one of the most common vectors of transmission is via the bite of an individual infected with HZV, where it travels into a fresh victim's bloodstream through the infected's saliva. Once inside the body, the virus appears to enter the host's cells, replicating at an alarming rate. There, it utilizes a reverse transcriptase enzyme to produce DNA from its own RNA genome, and this new DNA is then absorbed into the host's nucleus and incorporated into its genome via an integrase enzyme. This effectively makes it a provirus, which in turn transforms the cell and directs it to synthesize new virions. This is much different from other mononegaviruses, which do not produce DNA or use the nucleus for replication. It is in fact remarkably similar to the vampiric virus, though much smaller in size, and it's possible that the two share a common ancestor. From the point of infection, visible symptoms occur quite rapidly, within 1 to 2 hours. Like HVV, victims will experience a headache, fever, chills, and other flu-like symptoms, along with extreme thirst, itching, and an increase in heart rate and overall metabolism. This combination of factors, especially the latter two, facilitate the rapid proliferation of the virus and the onset of increasingly destructive symptoms. If bitten by an infected human, the infection is made worse by a bite wound filled with bacteria from the infected's mouth, causing even greater pain and inflammation. I have broken down the stages of zombic transformation into 3 parts, which I have observed personally. The aforementioned symptoms could be considered stage 1, with the victim progressing rapidly to stage 2. Coma. Though only lasting 4 to 6 hours, the accompanying fever raises body temperatures to unbearable heights, causing brain damage in virtually all cases. Rather than being a peaceful sleep, the zombic coma is clearly uncomfortable for its sufferers. I must admit that despite their scientific necessity, these comas rarely failed to elicit feelings of empathy toward the subjects of my own experimentation. At roughly the midpoint of the coma, the victim experiences cardiac arrest, and blood flow, breathing, metabolism, and body temperature abruptly plummet to nearly nothing. It is at this point that the victim enters stage 3, the transformation. Anyone near a victim as they undergo the latter half of their coma could easily be forgiven for thinking that the victim has died. Nearly all metabolic function is sharply reduced for a period of up to roughly 2 hours. It should be noted that the heart does indeed cease to beat, and it never resumes. I will explain this in more detail shortly. It is at this stage that many an unfortunate victim has been left for dead, or technically buried alive. But no matter what is done with the victim when they are assumed dead, this brief reduction in metabolic processes likely accounts for the idea that zombies return from the dead or are reanimated corpses. It may sound harsh, but abandonment or burial may actually be the best course of action, at least for anyone near the victim. Gradually, the victim will awaken from their coma, albeit in a catatonic state. Within an hour, they will rise, shambling about, often seeking the flesh of anyone nearby, and, in my testing, remaining unresponsive to virtually all stimuli. Unlike common portrayals in the media, newly awakened zombies are not mindless. On the contrary, they clearly retain some memories, and if awakened elsewhere, they may even attempt to shuffle to their home, though this behavior is motivated exclusively by hunger and facilitated by simple, rudimentary habit. Indeed, loved ones may greet the victim only to find themselves attacked by the shell that remains. Once more, I must thank you for listening up to this point. By now, it must have crossed your mind that surely all of this is the ravings of a madman, someone who has mistaken myth for reality. But I assure you, I have, through direct study, observation, and sample collection, obtained numerous evidences, each of which shed light on the biological processes that occur as a result of HZV. I will attempt to describe these now, beginning with the zombic brain. As previously mentioned, recent victims of HZV do not wake from their comas as mindless ghouls. Some semblance of humanity remains, though only for a brief time. Due to a now barely functioning circulatory system, a point to which we'll return, failing organs, as well as brain damage sustained from the coma's high fever, victims' ability to think and reason disappears immediately, though certain habits and abilities, such as driving a car or even using tools, may remain for 2 or 3 days. The ability to perform even simple tasks disappears as their bodies, including their gray matter, begins to decompose. They are transformed into a hunting machine and with a single-minded purpose: locate prey, capture prey, and feed. Certain hormonal functions persist, though serotonin production diminishes almost immediately following transformation, and the scent of flesh appears to flush their brains with adrenaline-like neurotransmitters, causing their characteristic voracity. Just as I did in the early phases of my research, you're likely wondering how a technically living creature could begin to decompose and even go on living without a functioning heart. In fact, these two symptoms are directly related. You see, once the heart arrests, both the nervous and circulatory systems are drastically restructured. And specifically, 2 fascinating phenomena occur in tandem. First, by a mechanism as yet unknown to me, the nervous system appears to proliferate, strengthening pathways and innervating muscles to a level not seen in the uninfected human. Second, and likely directly related, skeletal muscle assumes the role relinquished by the arrested heart, rhythmically contracting and relaxing. The increased nerve activity certainly assists with this, though it appears that the contractions that force blood through vessels and an almost peristaltic movement aren't terribly predictable, leading me to believe that zombic circulation is more of a reflexive action. Though it serves its purpose adequately, circulation via skeletal muscle is not efficient. As a result, blood moves relatively slowly throughout the body. The blood itself becomes viscous and dark, like oil. This is caused by increased iron and bile levels, which also improves oxygen storage. On one hand, slowed circulation is an advantage, as it makes clotting more effective. On the other, tissues and organs struggle greatly as a result, and eventually, nearly all are completely overtaken by necrosis. But thanks to their improved nervous system, zombies are able to remain mobile for much longer than their decaying bodies would otherwise allow. In fact, zombies have exhibited the ability to withstand significant trauma to both their central and peripheral nervous system, and both exhibit impressive regenerative abilities. In some cases I have tested, even a severed spinal cord is a mere inconvenience. I have documented zombies regaining the ability to walk after only 24 hours. Though the exact mechanism of this process of repair eludes me still, it appears that massive stem cell production and the absence of obstructive glial scarring are key elements. But with zombie biology, there is always a give and take. For example, an apparent increase in olfactory receptors and limbic neurons bestows upon them the ability to smell humans from as far as a mile away. But their other senses degrade greatly and rapidly. Due to the decaying of the lens and cornea, zombie eyes suffer severe myopia even early on, and as time passes, the scleras become red with inflammation, while the pupils become a gauzy white due to cataract formation. Necrosis will eventually take their vision, and even their eyeballs completely. It also takes their hearing and a majority of their sense of touch. But this decay also stunts their ability to feel severe pain, though chronic aching likely affects them greatly. Between their poor coordination and increasingly necrotic tissues, zombies are not able to move much faster than a shuffle. This makes them relatively easy to avoid and is likely why we haven't seen a major outbreak of HZV in modern times. At least, not yet. However, perhaps counterintuitively, if you were so unfortunate as to be caught by a zombie, you'd quickly discover that they are quite powerful. This is largely because, beginning in the coma stage, the muscles of the hands, forearms, and jaw recruit additional fibers. When contracted, these become a nearly unbreakable force. In fact, the average zombie's grip can exert up to 400 pounds of pressure per square inch, which is 10 times greater than humans. Perhaps even more fascinating, however, is what occurs in the jaw. During their coma, an increase in growth hormone facilitates the relatively rapid deposit of extra bone at the insertion points of major chewing muscles, such as the masseter. Additionally, the masseter itself, as well as the pterygoid and temporalis muscles, undergo a modification similar to what occurs in the arms, and as a result, zombies have an average bite force of well over 1,000 pounds per square inch. Contrast this with a normal human's bite force of up to 300 psi, and it becomes little wonder how zombies are able to tear into the toughest flesh and even grind bones with ease. But where the virus gives, once again, it takes away. Zombie teeth remain maladapted for the intense pressure their newly strengthened jaws are capable of, causing them to crack and, within a few meals, fall out. This doesn't halt the zombic imperative, however. They will continue to chew with only their exposed jaw bones until they too disintegrate. Zombies do possess another adaptation for their new diet of flesh. Their saliva is abnormally high in tissue factor, a protein found in the saliva of many organisms, though in much smaller quantities. Interestingly, this is one reason the virus is able to spread, despite the fact that the infected attempt to entirely consume potential new hosts. Anyone unfortunate enough to be attacked by a zombie may survive the encounter, as the coagulant nature of tissue factor stops major blood loss. Sadly, the agony of having major body parts chewed off and the subsequent relief at having survived the encounter is all in vain. Survivors will almost definitely contract the virus, invariably transforming them into zombies themselves. But in contrast to common conception, zombies will seek out any kind of meat, not only human and especially not limited to the brain. They will, however, avoid necrotic flesh of any kind, and as such, I have never observed them to attack each other. In any case, no matter how advanced their degradation, zombies still undergo normal bodily functions and must also ingest water, usually obtained from streams, puddles, and in early stages, even water bottles. The zombie digestive system itself remains largely unaltered, save for the gradual rotting away of its tissues and organs. Unsurprisingly, zombies must also urinate, but thanks to a combination of poor circulation, brain damage, and kidney necrosis, they are physically incapable of doing so. This condition, known as urinary retention, causes the bladder to swell to a grotesque size, and eventually it will burst. The abdomen is then flooded with the retained fluid, and it will remain there until a wound or ulcer perforates the abdominal wall. Indeed, the life of a zombie is one of numerous bodily horrors, and between their decaying bodies and reduced ability to absorb nutrients from their food, most zombies will truly die in less than a year's time, a direct contrast to the common notion of the immortal undead. This claim of lifespan comes from direct personal observation, but if you happen to see a zombie in the wild, as it were, its age could be determined from the amount of decay apparent from its outward appearance. Between months 1 and 3 post-transformation, zombie skin is mottled, often peeling, and dotted with open sores. Between 4 and 6 months, the epidermis begins to split as underlying necrotic tissue bloats outward, and eyelids, lips, nose, ears, teeth, hair, nails, and sometimes fingers have all but rotted away. By 9 months, entire limbs are missing, as are most prominent facial features, and exposed bone is common. The eyes may have fallen out by this time, and the decay of the digestive system has led to a nearly unfathomable level of emaciation. Needless to say, it is within the first couple of months when zombies are at their most dangerous. But while a single zombie poses little threat to a healthy human, the reality is that unless their numbers are kept in check by vigilant citizens, they usually don't hunt alone. Often drawn to the same sources of sense, zombies tend to congregate together, and though I have yet to determine the exact reason for this behavior, especially in early stages, it seems likely that it's the result of a residual and deep-seated human need for community. Within a very short amount of time after an outbreak, herds of dozens of zombies can form. Surprisingly, zombies exhibit rudimentary forms of group hierarchy. The strongest of the herd eat first, and any who approach too early will be dealt with aggressively. Most surprising of all, there is evidence of larger groups working together to attack humans through very basic flanking maneuvers. But of course, the main catalyst for hunting behavior is simple: the scent of flesh and, at least while their vision remains, movement. Indeed, even while feeding, zombies are relatively easily distracted. They may abandon a downed victim in order to pursue another, more mobile victim. Interestingly, this is another reason why HZV is able to spread. Victims are sometimes able to escape while their attacker's attention is diverted to another source of food. Fortunately for us, zombie outbreaks tend to fizzle out relatively quickly as zombies move slowly and cover little ground. Once they've exhausted the food supply in any given area, they often starve to death before many new zombies can be created. One example of this can be found in the notable outbreak that occurred in 1863 in Vicksburg, Mississippi. During the famous Siege of Vicksburg, a major turning point in the Civil War, roughly 30,000 Confederate soldiers were effectively trapped inside the city by surrounding Union forces. A couple of weeks into the siege, reports of erratic behavior from soldiers and civilians alike began to circulate, and Union troops reported gunfire from within the city limits, though not directed toward them. By the time the Confederate troops surrendered some 40 days after the siege began, Union soldiers were shocked and appalled to find decayed corpses littering the streets and half-consumed victims lying beside them. This story is not widely known, but the reality of the matter is that in the siege of Vicksburg, the U.S. narrowly averted a much worse disaster. Fortunately, when it comes to defending yourself from a potential outbreak, knowledge is the true power. Many who have heard the tales of the living dead have been erroneously taught that an attacking zombie can be felled by simple, direct damage to the brain, whether by firearm or impalement. In reality, zombies are able to withstand a shocking amount of trauma, both to the body and brain. Destroying certain parts of the brain may disable certain functions, such as the thalamus and cerebellum, which may cause blindness and loss of balance, respectively, but the only thing that can quickly stop a zombie is to severely damage the brainstem. The most effective method is to sever the head completely, but if time isn't a factor, though it usually is, zombies can be killed by damaging any part of the body with enough force. After all, they still require their internal organs, such as intestines and lungs, to function. However, as indicated previously, zombies are able to recover from even a severed spinal cord, so aiming for anything other than the brainstem is a risky endeavor. One myth commonly associated with zombies is that their heads continue to live even after decapitation. Given their resilience, the idea isn't terribly far-fetched, but the reality is somewhat less sensational. Following decapitation, zombies may continue to exhibit movement, such as blinking and even biting, for up to a full minute, at which point all activity ceases. Still, this is quite a bit longer than in humans, which may remain conscious for up to 30 seconds following a beheading. This difference is likely caused by additional oxygen in the zombie's slow-moving blood, though increased neural resilience may play a factor as well. And so, once again, dear listener, I must thank you for listening to my findings and, admittedly, ramblings thus far. If you have found even a glimmer of belief within yourself during this presentation, I implore you to seek me out. If you are unable to do so, then I have but one humble request. Do not let the sun set on this work. Though outbreaks have so far been limited to areas of the world that our modern culture finds easy to dismiss, I can assure you that unless precautions are taken, it's only a matter of time before a convergence of outbreaks becomes catastrophic. At that point, the loss of life will be unstoppable, and we could find ourselves trapped inside rotting flesh, doomed to wander the earth until our decaying bodies fail, returning us to the dust from which we came. Without conceit, I regard it as self-evident that my research has shown a scientific light into many dark corners once relegated to the domain of the supernatural. But despite the many avenues down which my research has led me, few can compare to the horrors I present to you today, of the human body cruelly twisted into a canine form so animalistic it shocks the senses. Throughout history, tales and legends of dogmen appear in nearly every culture in the world, from the cursed Lycaon of ancient Greece to the widespread werewolves and cynocephaly of medieval Europe, to the rougarou of Cajun folklore, and even to the modern sightings of creatures such as the alleged Beast of Bray Road. What I present to you today, my valued listener, however unbelievable it may seem, is that each of these accounts is rooted in some level of truth, a primal fear seated deep in humanity's subconscious, and one that I believe can be traced to mankind's first contact with a devastating virus I have named the lycanthropic parvovirus. But before we move into the details of this microscopic horror, permit me to provide some context for the work that led to its discovery. As I previously alluded, for decades my own research forged a path that may have never intersected with this particular virus. But then, nearly by chance, I met a brilliant biologist equally passionate and similarly motivated to uncover truths that mainstream academia refused to entertain. Sadly, though we were able to trade ideas for a time, the thread of fate that had pulled us together was tragically and very suddenly severed. This scientist, whose name, at least for now, will remain in anonymity lest her legacy be tarnished, was killed by the very organisms she studied. I found her in her home, her body rent in pieces. Even still, her research became the foundation of my own, though most was gleaned from the pages of the detailed journals she left behind. And though I am grateful for her notes and our brief time together, the findings that were her life's work have become a heavy burden. The light of science, at its core, is a wondrous form of systematic discovery. But I sometimes wonder if, perhaps, some things are best left in the dark. As you likely know by now, my own work has led to the momentous, though as yet largely unaccepted, discoveries of the human vampiric virus and the human zombic virus. Both appear to be members of mononegavirales, and each, through a cascade of genetic alterations, transforms their hosts into violent killing machines, though in very different ways. But in terms of morphological restructuring, neither of these viruses can compare to the lycanthropic parvovirus, which eventually causes such drastic changes in its hosts that they can scarcely be recognized as having once been human. At the risk of pressing your gracious allowance, I will now move on into the second part of my presentation, the virus itself. As the name indicates, LPV is classified in the family Parvoviridae. In general, parvoviruses are capable of infecting numerous species, though most people are familiar with the canine and feline strains, which cause severe and life-threatening diseases in wild animals and pets alike. In humans, parvoviruses are much less severe, frequently causing no symptoms whatsoever. What makes LPV unique is that it is zoonotic, easily transmitted to humans via the bite of an infected canine. Specifically, in nearly every case, it's the bite of a Canis lupus, a gray wolf, or one of its many subspecies. Indeed, this virus appears to be highly specialized, unable to infect or be carried by any organisms except for canines and primates. As a result, the most common victims of lycanthropy, or lichens as I call them, are those whose profession brings them in frequent contact with wolves, such as hunters, trappers, and lumberjacks. Upon entering a host's bloodstream, rather than targeting a single type of tissue, the lycanthropic parvovirus proceeds to infect and, on some level, transform every living cell with a nucleus in the body. Most parvoviruses enter host cells by endocytosis, traveling to the nucleus where they wait until the cell enters its replication stage. Only then is the virus's genome uncoded and replicated, at which point the virus's messenger RNA is transcribed and translated. Eventually, mature virions exit the host cell via lysis, or destruction of the host cell. But the lycanthropic parvovirus appears to utilize a much stealthier method of reproduction. Rather than destroying the host cell, which the body could associate with inflammation, thereby alerting the immune system of its presence, the new virions bud from the host cell, leaving it intact, though altered. In this regard, LPV is perhaps more similar to human papillomavirus, which is a similar non-enveloped DNA virus that alters cellular genomes without destroying the cell itself. In fact, because LPV does appear to be a DNA virus rather than RNA, as with the previously described HVV and HZV, no reverse transcription from RNA to DNA is necessary. Upon entering a cell, the viral DNA can immediately integrate itself into the host's chromosomes. In short, the changes that lycanthropic parvovirus makes to its host's cells are drastic and rapid. In my studies, I have observed that the onset of symptoms occurs at roughly 24 hours from the point of infection. These symptoms are somewhat generic hallmarks of an extreme immune response: severe thirst, high fever, chills, and even itching, the latter of which is likely related to metabolic increase brought on by the virus. These are similar to the other diseases I have presented, but unlike HVV and HZV, the lycanthropic virus appears to have no need of a coma to facilitate the transformation of its host. By the 48-hour mark, the fever begins to dissipate, and the other symptoms are drastically reduced. However, new symptoms rapidly begin to take their place. Extremely rapid hair growth becomes apparent, and the victim becomes increasingly violent. Communication with the victim becomes nearly impossible as their responses degrade into grunts, growls, and hisses. Attempts to restrain patients at this stage often result in self-harm and even more extreme aggression. Indeed, the victim will take great efforts to flee from the company of any humans, presumably to complete their transformation in a more secluded area. But now, I must warn you, even if you regard my previous work as truthful, the transformation that follows LPV infection is so radical, the contortions it places upon the body so disturbing, that even in recounting it here, I scarcely believe it myself. The transformation from the humanoid body plan to that of a lichen is drastic and, even to the scientifically minded, disturbing. Indeed, few could look upon the lichen's distorted visage without having to stifle a sense of fear and repulsion that rises from the id like a dormant memory. However, in stark contrast to the portrayals in movies, novels, and even folklore, this transformation does not wait for a full moon, and it takes far longer than mere hours to complete. Approximately 1 week following infection, major physiological changes begin to take place. Though the exact mechanisms are a subject of my ongoing research, I have found evidence to indicate that essentially, the viral DNA takes over the body's process of cellular differentiation, selectively altering certain parts of the human genome based on the final design of the organism. As the infected cells shift and divide according to their newly modified genetic instructions, the victim undergoes an agonizing reshaping of bones and soft tissues. Worse, rather than being over in a single night, this agony is very long-lived. Unfortunately, because it places a great deal of strain on the victim's heart and body, many do not survive the transformation. Such has often been the case in my own research. This, combined with the difficulty in locating infected individuals in the first place, has forced me to infer much about the stages of transformation, mainly from corpses of those who died in the process. In any case, it appears that the entire transformation is complete in 6 weeks. During that time, the unfortunate victim prefers isolation, and likely as a result of their torment, will lash out strongly at any who attempt to draw near. Needless to say, the common notion of a werewolf who transforms at the full moon and then back again is biological fantasy, and the changes that the lycanthropic parvovirus enacts upon its hosts are completely irreversible. However, my personal mantra is that there is some truth to just about every myth, and as I present the information I have gleaned from my own research and that of my colleague, we will discuss just what biological adaptations are fiction and which are rooted in unsettling reality. The earliest changes to occur in a victim's body are twofold: widespread hair growth and, in order to adapt to an increasingly nocturnal hunting pattern, heightened senses. Of course, thick fur is a hallmark of the lycanthropic appearance, and this is one aspect of the legends that is very real. It appears that the virus may reactivate a certain gene that plays a role in embryonic hair growth, but is normally dormant in adults, SOX3. Essentially, the result is generalized terminal hypertrichosis, a condition not without precedent in humans, though it is rare and not nearly as universal as what is triggered by LPV, and which causes the growth of terminal hair across parts of the body which are normally hairless, such as the nose, forehead, ears, back, etc. In fact, the only areas that remain hairless by the end of the lichen transformation are the palms of the hand and the soles of the feet. At the same time, an increase in melanin production turns the skin a very light or very dark gray, depending on the victim's ethnicity. Victims' eyes begin to appear bloodshot due to the increased blood flow, which supports the formation of tapetum lucidum tissue behind the eye, which serves to reflect light. This greatly improves night vision and causes their characteristic eye shine. Toward the latter part of their transformation, loss of pigment in the iris brightens its hue to either a pale icy blue or an intense yellow-amber coloration. This is the primary sensory change that facilitates their newly nocturnal behavior, but changes in their brain also occur. Alterations to the suprachiasmatic nuclei of the hypothalamus work to entirely reverse the victim's circadian rhythm. Other senses are greatly improved as well. Auditory perception quadruples, while olfaction is nearly 100 times keener than that of an uninfected human. Autopsies reveal hypertrophic limbic neurons and a proliferation of receptor cells, which may explain these heightened senses. One area of my research that still requires extensive testing is what occurs in the lichen brain. It appears that large portions of the prefrontal cortex and hippocampus are reduced in mature lichens, leading me to believe that this is at least partially to blame for their extreme aggression and apparent lack of reasoning abilities. Of course, some of this likely has to do with their often overwhelming need for food, but this is a point to which we'll return. But while all of these changes begin relatively early in the transformation process, the next few weeks involve much greater and more fundamental modifications. Triggered by increased production of growth hormone from the pituitary gland and insulin-like growth factor from the liver, unprecedented bone and muscle growth occurs throughout the body and, as a side effect, causes the skin to swell and bruise. In many major bones, such as those in the arms, legs, hands, and feet, hyaline cartilage cells in the epiphyseal plate, a zone normally dormant in adults, are reactivated. In these particular bones, cartilage cells called osteoclasts break down bone tissue by dissolving its mineralized matrix, a process known as bone resorption, while chondrocytes form new cartilage to replace the missing bone. Finally, fibroblasts strengthen the cartilage by reinforcing it with additional collagen. Once this process is complete, cartilage can once again stack inside the open growth plates and spread across the outside of the skeleton to form new bone tissue via osteoblasts, which replace old cartilage as it degenerates. But bone that grows in length alone could quickly become brittle, especially when the force of the victim's added muscles enact on it. To resolve this, most larger bones in the lichen's body also undergo appositional growth, which causes them to increase in diameter and thereby greatly increasing their density and strength. Interestingly, the coccyx or tailbone is also elongated, forming a rudimentary and largely non-functional tail of sorts. These processes are mostly finished by the end of the 6-week period, though less pronounced growth may continue for years following the transformation. But perhaps the most drastic and obvious changes occur in the bones of the face and skull. Beginning at approximately 1 week post-infection, the viscerocranium undergoes massive restructuring. The maxilla, mandible, and nasal bone, facilitated by additional ossification triggered by the same process as the rest of the body, begin to grotesquely elongate. Other affected bones are the zygomatic bone and arch, which add thickness to support the enlarged facial bones. Additionally, the anterior nasal aperture is shifted forward along with the surrounding bones, and new layers are added to the spongy matrix within the nasal cavity. As the nasal bone and maxilla push forward, the lateral, alar, and septal cartilage of the external nose are compressed, and the fibrofatty tissue that makes up the nostrils is redistributed slightly, severely flattening the nose. Meanwhile, the lower jaw shifts forward slightly and undergoes elongation via similar processes. Observations of corpses who died in various stages of this transformation indicate that the facial bones and jaw don't always grow at the same rate, sometimes leaving the lichen with an under or overbite until the transformation is complete. Though not nearly as pronounced as many depictions in art and the media portray, by the end of the roughly 6-week period, all of these changes do bestow upon the victim an almost mesocephalic snout, and one that is admittedly strikingly canine in appearance. Accentuating this lupine visage is a tightening of the auricular muscles, which usually serve to move the ears slightly back and upward, positioning them higher on the head and aiding the lichen's enhanced hearing. Eventually, perhaps months after transformation, a gradual and unknown process also seems to collapse certain cartilage in the ear's helix, giving it a distinctly pointed shape. But of course, these aren't the only changes that occur in the head. Dentition is also substantially altered. Normal humans have a total of about 32 teeth, 4 canines, 8 incisors, 8 premolars, and 12 molars. Like wolves and bears, however, lichens have up to 42, 4 canines, 12 incisors, 16 premolars, and 10 molars. It also appears that a triggering of odontogenesis essentially causes a condition known as hyperdontia, which results in the growth of supplemental supernumerary teeth. As of this recording, I have yet to determine exactly how this happens, but my research suggests that these teeth develop from additional tooth buds that arise directly from the dental lamina, or perhaps split from the bud of the original tooth itself. In normal humans, hyperdontia would likely cause severe overcrowding, but because the lichen jaws also elongate, space is not an issue. Additionally, the canine teeth are substantially enlarged, as specialized ameloblasts travel through the narrow pores of the dentin and crown, and once they reach the surface, deposit additional enamel onto its tip. This is very similar to what occurs in vampire dentition, and with similar fang-like results. Finally, the chewing muscles of the jaw, namely the masseter, pterygoid, and temporal muscles, are greatly enlarged, which gives fully transformed lichens an immensely powerful bite force. I have yet to determine a controllable method to test just how powerful it is, but I will add these findings when they become available. But we cannot move on from the subject of lichen bone structure without discussing their hands and feet. During the mid to late part of their transformation, the victim's nails on both fingers and toes begin to loosen. Eventually, eventually they will fall out entirely as the distal phalanx bones grow into hooked claws. These slowly erupt from the former nail beds as hard keratin forms around the new quicks. Though they are initially short and small, these claws can grow to over 6 inches in length. By the end of their transformation, the lichen hand is strikingly similar to the claw of a bear, and lichen's use of their thumb is similarly restricted, making it easier to move on all fours. A fully transformed lichen's feet also exhibit similar claws. Thanks to the elongation and thickening of the forearms, feet, and spinal column, moving in a quadrupedal stance appears to be remarkably comfortable for a formerly fully bipedal creature, though thanks to their newly shaped feet, which are generally plantigrade during bipedal movement and digitigrade while on all fours, and their enlarged pelvic and shoulder girdles, moving between stances appears to be equally comfortable. But comfortable is not a word anyone would use to describe the transformation process itself. It is likely immensely painful, like severe and pervasive growing pains sustained for weeks. This pain is likely compounded by the numerous changes that occur in the internal organs. Though the digestive and cardiovascular symptoms remain largely unchanged, structurally speaking, most organs, including the heart, become greatly enlarged in order to cope with the lichen's increased body mass. In fact, the heart is so enlarged that fully transformed lichens experience a decreased resting heart rate of around 40 to 50 beats per minute, similar to that of a large bear. As such, the physiological reliance on this organ makes them much more vulnerable to chest injuries, especially since their ability to clot blood, heal injuries, and fight infection is not superior to humans and other mammals. The common conception that silver is more effective than any other kind of bullet is pure fiction. Older lichens also exhibit shorter digestive tracts, likely an adaptation to their diet, which leads directly to my next point. To fuel their increased muscle hypertrophy, the extreme alterations in skeletal composition, and their increased overall metabolism, infected individuals must consume copious amounts of food, and more specifically, protein. Though they prefer isolation a majority of the time, lichens are not picky when it comes to food sources. Indeed, any living thing in close proximity to a lichen is truly in mortal danger, and they will likely fall victim to these beasts' insatiable appetite. The net effect of these extreme alterations to the humanoid body plan is clear. Post-transformation, victims of LPV are reduced to an aggressive, animalistic state. Legs and arms are restructured to allow for effective locomotion in both bipedal and quadrupedal stances. The facial muscles and bones form a kind of snout, and medium-length hair covers their entire body. These stark and even radical changes are cemented until the poor creature dies, though I have no evidence to show that lichen lifespans are longer or shorter than the average humans. Needless to say, it is clear where the persisting legends of werewolves come from. But one nagging question has likely already occurred to you, as it did to me in the early phases of my research. Why would a virus induce a transformation that requires such a high biological cost? My hypothesis is simple. The virus itself likely originated in canines in the distant past, and through a process known as horizontal gene transfer, it likely assimilated so much of its host's genome that it has little choice but to express similar characteristics in any host it infects. It just so happens that primates are the only other mammals it's capable of infecting. Generally speaking, based on the discovery of dozens of well-preserved fossils, records of which were provided by my deceased colleague, I believed that the first true lichens originated in the forest-heavy landmass of Eurasia, possibly after infecting and wiping out our Neanderthal cousins. As humanity progressed into the medieval era, we never lost the deep-seated fear of our lichen predators. As a result, legends of distant lands populated by dog-headed men persisted, as did the concept of the terrifying werewolf. Even today, these legends are ingrained in our culture. Many have thought of lycanthropy as a fictional metaphor for the duality of man, a personification of the ongoing struggle between the enlightened person and our basest instincts. But while these discussions may have merit, the reality is that lichens, werewolves, are very real. Some night, my dear listener, you may find yourself wandering through a lonely wood. You wouldn't see the attack coming, and if you miraculously survived it, you'd retain your wits long enough to see your skin grow fur, your limbs lengthen, and claws sprout from your fingertips. As the agony and madness overtakes you, prompted only by a lowly virus, metaphors and philosophies will not cross your mind. You'll be consumed by only one thought: to kill. Another presentation. For years, legends of indigenous peoples in the northern United States and southern Canada have spoken of a terrifying creature known as the wendigo. This mysterious and malevolent being is said to haunt the snowy wilderness, preying on unsuspecting travelers and feasting on human flesh. I warn you, what you'll find here is likely not what you expect. Modern portrayals of the Wendigo legend have warped public perception of this biological horror, and the reality is likely far different than the image in your mind. But make no mistake, this pale specter is no less terrifying. Lend me your ear, valued listener, as I present to you my personal findings as to the form and function of the Wendigo. In the Northern Territories, winter falls quickly, lying on the land like a body, heavy and unfeeling. But in those regions, it's more than simply cold. Winter seems to swallow warmth, drawing it out of every surface it touches. Long, frigid nights are broken only by the howling of the wind, and the forests that teemed with life only months before become lonely and desolate. Stalking this frozen wilderness is a creature of legend, a spirit of the lonely places, a hunger that is never satisfied. Selfishness personified. The Algonquin people have many names for it, a kind of manitou most often called the wendigo or wendigo. The wendigo is said to be cursed to wander the land, eternally seeking to fulfill their voracious appetite for human flesh. In the harsh conditions brought on by winter, men and women often found themselves doubting that the little food they had would carry them through to spring. Eventually, supplies would begin to thin, and many had to face starvation and eventually death. It is here that the wendigo is said to make its appearance, where desperation meets self-interest and people are left with an unthinkable choice: consume another human being or die. Anyone who succumbs to this temptation, the most reprehensible act possible in Algonquin culture, was said to become possessed by the spirit of the wendigo and would undergo a horrific transformation in both mind and body. In eating the flesh of a fellow human, one was forced to surrender their own humanity, and though they ate, they would never be satisfied. Since the time of the earliest contact with the Native American and First Nations people, sightings of the wendigo have been reported from Canada, the Great Lakes, and northern Minnesota, though they are almost certainly present in a much larger geographic area. My grandfather, anthropologist Harold Zeiger, would often tell me stories of the Ojibwe people, among whom he spent a considerable amount of time observing their culture and rituals and documenting their oral histories. These stories frequently included accounts of the wendigo, a creature that, I must admit, kept my younger self awake many a night, hardly daring to glance at my bedroom window, lest a cold, pale shadow in the woods outside should catch my gaze. Of course, as is commonly known, many years ago, while on a university-funded trip to the Minnesota-Canada border, Professor Zeiger went missing, and I never heard from my grandfather again. But that is a story for another time. There is perhaps no greater external agent of change than the lowly and insidious virus, an organism exquisite in its simultaneous complexity and simplicity. Forged by eons of specialization, viruses inhabit nearly every biome on the planet, and the frigid regions of Central North America are no different. At some point in early humans here, there appeared a strain that I believe to be part of the class Herbivoricides, a virus that I have tentatively dubbed the Progressive Anthropophagic Virus, or PAV. Indeed, PAV would be a new addition to a class previously occupied solely by Herpes virales, an order that includes numerous herpes viruses, none of which are normally fatal in humans, or which cause such drastic revisions to their host's cellular genomes. My reason for this potential classification has to do with PAV's structural similarity to HSV-1. Like that virus, PAV is a double-stranded DNA virus with an icosahedral capsid enclosed in a glycoprotein-containing lipid envelope. What separates this virus from its likely cousin, however, is its method of infection and the areas of the body it targets. Upon infection, usually via the mucosal epithelium of the mouth, the virus spreads via axonal transport along the internal laryngeal nerve and ultimately to the inferior ganglion of the vagus nerve. Infection is usually inapparent, and if any symptoms are present, they're often dismissed as the common cold or even seasonal allergies, sore throat, slight fever, and general malaise. But once the virus has spread to the inferior ganglion, the viral genome goes silent, seeming to cloak itself in a coating of nucleosomes and enters an extended latent phase. Occasionally, however, certain environmental conditions may cause the virus to reactivate, at which point it uncoats its nucleocapsid and begins the process of replication, transcription, and assembly before budding from the host cells and finally traveling back to the nearby mucosal epithelium. As you might have guessed, during a flare-up, the infected individual's saliva is highly contagious, and even sharing an eating utensil could easily pass the virus to a new host. Unfortunately for most infected individuals, these occasional reactivation cycles trigger a rapid immune response, and the virus is usually effectively forced to return to a latent state within a few days. Indeed, after the initial infection, the virus may remain latent for decades, and in many individuals, no symptoms will ever present themselves. It is my belief that in the cold northern regions, PAV has silently thrived for hundreds of years within a very large population, though given the rarity of long-distance travel, at least relative to modern times, it remains somewhat isolated, and so an infected individual may be content to live with the virus indefinitely, never any the wiser. That is, unless the victim undergoes a very particular and immense psychological strain, one that perhaps may include the life and death decision of whether to engage in the most horrific act known to their culture, and one that will surely fracture their humanity forever. I've now described the microbe that causes this terrifying transformation, but the question likely tugging at your mind is this: how can a latent virus, housed in a very specific part of the anatomy, trigger any widespread changes? To find the answer to that very question, I packed my equipment and traveled north. I had to find a specimen for myself. I met with members of the Ojibwe tribe in an area just west of Lake Superior and in close proximity to the very place my grandfather had visited years before. The details of what transpired there are beyond the scope of this presentation. Suffice it to say that what I encountered was immensely beneficial to my research, and as a result, I believe I can hypothesize accurately as to the direct nature of this virus. Imagine, if you will, that you and a few close members of your family have embarked on a hunting trip deep into the snow-covered forest. At some point, you find yourselves lost in a blizzard. By the time it clears, you've completely lost your bearings. After weeks of wandering, you've exhausted your supplies. Gradually, your hunger overwhelms your every thought. Eventually, one of your family members falls to the cold. You and the others mourn, but in the days following, you begin to trade uneasy glances. Still, though the situation is desperate, you are not willing to cross that line. But as the days wear on, hope begins to dwindle, and you struggle to fight the urge to simply eat, to quell the pain, the hunger, to fuel your body. Then one night you sit at the fire with the relentless wind gnawing at your tattered clothes. You can no longer feel your frostbitten feet, but still you try to warm them. The body of your deceased loved one lies nearby, underneath a hastily constructed rock grave. Your mouth waters, but still your mind resists. Amazingly, despite the cold, a bead of sweat trickles down your cheek and you feel your pulse quicken. In your mind, an agonizing battle rages. You know you cannot give in, but you also know that you must. Suddenly, you can bear the mental torture no longer. Something snaps, and almost as if propelled, you move toward your relative's lifeless form. What I've described here, dear listener, is the trigger that leads to the wendigo's transformation. As previously mentioned, for many individuals, an extreme viral reactivation would blessedly never occur, but in times of sheer desperation, a unique combination of factors would send the virus into overdrive, overwhelming the immune system's attempts to stop it. It has been well documented that the lateral portions of the orbitofrontal cortex fire when, despite their moral beliefs, one is faced with no choice but to cause harm to others. In fact, this region of the brain has long been associated with feelings of extreme displeasure, and needless to say, for many, no act is so revolting as that of consuming a member of their own species. But the orbitofrontal cortex plays another role as well. Through a network of neural pathways, it is connected to the amygdala, a structure responsible for emotional processing and, crucially, regulation of the stress hormone cortisol. Normally, these two structures form a kind of feedback loop. The amygdala detects and responds to emotionally relevant stimuli, while the orbitofrontal cortex processes this information and sends signals back to the amygdala and other brain regions to help modulate the emotional response. But when faced with starvation, death, and a complete upheaval of the values it holds, the amygdala floods the body with cortisol as per a normal response to stress, and the virus, lying in wait within the vagus ganglion, begins its process of reactivation. It is the sustained release of this hormone, fueled by the increased neural activity within the lateral regions of the orbitofrontal cortex, that begins a vicious cycle. First, in preparation for a fight or flight response, cortisol is known to suppress the immune system, and chronic elevations can even lead to a decreased number of circulating lymphocytes. Second, and more directly, though the exact process is still yet to be proven, it appears that cortisol itself reactivates the latent PAV by a process known as glucocorticoid receptor-mediated reactivation. It does this by binding to a glucocorticoid receptor on the virus's host cell, which then causes the host cells to express genes which promote the replication of PAV. In short, prolonged exposure to elevated levels of cortisol has been shown to greatly increase the virulence of pathogens within the body and overall pathogenicity, even with other viral infections such as HSV-1. The virus then spreads via axonal transport from the inferior vagal ganglion along the entire vagus nerve, eventually directly infecting the larynx, thyroid, and even aspects of the digestive system, crucial points to which we'll return shortly. And thus, the virus spreads like a wildfire, fanned by cortisol and, to a lesser extent, epinephrine, until it triggers a cascade of alterations to the victim's anatomy and physiology, the result of which is an irreversible loss of their essential humanity. The first signs of viral reactivation within a PAV victim are subtle. Numbness in the feet and hands may occur, as well as a dark discoloration of the digits. At first, this is likely to be attributed to frostbite, but in fact, though frostbite may also be present, it is due to a severe increase in blood sugar, a point we'll come back to shortly, leading eventually to damage in the blood vessels and nerves of the extremities. This is actually a form of necrosis, and over time, the victim's rotting flesh will begin to emit a pungent scent, one that has been described as an odor of decay and decomposition, of death and corruption. But sadly, for a victim of PAV reactivation, this is only the beginning. As the virus travels along the vagus nerve, one of the first organs it infects is responsible for metabolic regulation. The thyroid. This results in a condition known as viral thyroiditis, which in turn leads to inflammation, enlargement, and an overproduction of hormones of and by the thyroid. For those affected by PAV, this appears to be a form of hyperthyroidism, and for the first few days following viral reactivation, the victim's circulatory system is flooded with, among other hormones, thyroxine. This serves to boost the body's production of energy, which the victim may at first find invigorating. However, prolonged exposure over the course of roughly 2 weeks causes a number of side effects, including greatly increased metabolism, appetite, and a significant loss of adipose tissue. Interestingly, it is the increased body temperature resulting from this spiked metabolism that allows victims of PAV to survive the cold winter weather far longer than a normal human could, giving them a stark advantage in the frigid landscape. But this is only the start of a cascade of physiological events that lead to the wendigo's notoriously ravenous appetite. The vagus nerve is also responsible for the regulation and feedback reception of numerous digestive processes, and as the reactivated virus makes its way to the gut, it will eventually travel along its pancreatic branch. At the pancreas, it appears to induce beta cell apoptosis via the activation of gene networks under the control of various, though very specific, transcription factors. In other words, this causes the rapid and widespread death of insulin-producing cells of the pancreas, which, in turn, causes blood glucose levels to rise uncontrolled, a condition known as hyperglycemia. This process of beta cell death has been observed in other viral infections, but never to an extent I have observed in PAV infection. Thus, even as the victim intakes increasing amount of food, without insulin, their body is unable to process or store glycogen or glucose, leading to an increased severity of hunger, known as polyphagia. This, in turn, causes specialized cells in the stomach lining to continuously release ghrelin, a hormone that travels to the hypothalamus, a region of the brain that regulates hunger and the balance of energy, and binds to specific receptors there to stimulate hunger, further exacerbating the victim's unrelenting desire for food. Paradoxically, no matter how much food the victim consumes, they remain not only unsatiated, but they continue to lose fat, resulting in a gaunt and deeply emaciated appearance. But the legends of the wendigo often describe not only ravenous hunger, but a specific taste for human flesh. My own observations have led me to believe that while humans are certainly targeted by victims of PAV, they will also pursue any source of protein available to them. It just so happens that in the dead of winter, humans are often the most readily available food source. Ultimately, over the course of 2 to 3 months, PAV leads to a complete disruption of energy homeostasis. This upending of the natural order is mirrored in the legends of the wendigo. The spirit of the lonely places is itself a disruption in the natural order of the world. The eventual consequence of this self-focus is ruin, and sadly, with victims of PAV, that is exactly what happens. Because they can neither effectively fuel their bodies nor resist the urge to eat at any cost, many wendigo die of starvation within 3 to 4 months. Many others are killed killed before their full transformation takes place, while others freeze to death. Ultimately, and tragically, prognosis for PAV victims following a traumatic reactivation is universal fatality. But the aforementioned lack of insulin in the victim's body has another side effect. My observations indicate that as with lichen physiology in response to the lycanthropic parvovirus, victims of PAV undergo a similarly unprecedented bone growth. This is especially apparent in the major bones of the limbs. The increase in metabolism brought on by the virus appears to stimulate the production of growth hormone-releasing hormone, growth hormone itself, and insulin-like growth factor from the hypothalamus, pituitary gland, and liver, respectively. The low levels of insulin in the body, a hormone that normally regulates production of these other hormones, instead allows them to increase unchecked. This leads to increased endochondral ossification or longitudinal bone growth along the tibia, fibula, femur, humerus, radius, and ulna, as well as certain regions of the digits. As with LPV, this appears to involve the activation of hyaline cartilage cells in the epiphyseal plate. This zone, which is usually dormant in adults, seems to experience sudden reactivation. During this process, osteoclasts, a type of cartilage cell, break down the mineralized matrix of the bone through a process called bone resorption. This is followed by chondrocytes forming new cartilage to replace the missing bone. Fibroblasts then strengthen the cartilage by reinforcing it with collagen. After the completion of this process, new cartilage can stack inside the open growth plates and spread across the exterior of the skeleton to form new bone tissue, a process carried out by osteoblasts which replace the old cartilage as it degenerates. However, unlike LPV, I have observed very little apositional growth. This is likely due to the fact that wendigo musculature remains largely unaltered. Indeed, victims of PAV exhibit average human strength and speed. Without the need to support enhanced muscles, it is my assumption that additional bone density simply isn't necessary. The ultimate effect is not only one of increased limb length, adding to the victim's uncannily. It is here that I feel compelled to mention the wendigo's characteristic skin tone. While some pigmentation remains in every specimen I have studied, there is little doubt that an as yet unknown mechanism, whether by the viral infection or ensuing response, results in the death of melanocytes throughout the skin, bestowing on the victim an exceedingly pale appearance. This could give a wendigo a purposeful advantage in the snowy regions where it hunts, but it could also be an unrelated side effect of another, admittedly unknown, process. Another notable aspect of wendigo morphology is their overall lack of hair. Indeed, hair loss is one of the earliest signs of viral reactivation in PAV victims. Subjects often notice their hair thinning or even coming out in chunks within mere days following the traumatic episode. I should note that while hair loss is common, it is the least predictable symptom of the virus. Some individuals may lose virtually all the hair on their body, adding to their ghastly visage, while others may only notice a slight thinning, and still others may exhibit a delayed response or no hair loss at all. In those victims where hair loss does occur, it appears that the body's response to the virus results in a condition similar to telogen effluvium, in which hair follicles prematurely stop growing and essentially suspend in the telogen or resting phase. For victims of PAV, however, the hairs affected by telogen effluvium will stay in the resting phase indefinitely, causing the follicles to fall out and, at least in my observations, never regrow. It's possible that if a cure were ever discovered, the follicles could exit the telogen phase and regrow, but at this point, that remains pure conjecture. While the exact process that causes this hair loss is still undefined in my research, I suspect it has to do with the victim's extreme stress response, a known cause of hair loss in many other diseases and syndromes. Now though, I'll move on to another hallmark of the wendigo's appearance, its deadly claws. Rather than extensions of bone, as is the case for lichens, individuals with PAV present an accelerated rate of keratin production by onychoblasts within the proximal nail matrix of the digits in both the hands and feet, leading to a marked thickening and augmentation of the nails themselves. Unlike in patients afflicted with the human vampiric virus, whose nails undergo a similar growth pattern, here the rate of nail growth occurs much faster than normal. Rather than taking months, patients with PAV have typically formed rudimentary claws within 3 days. I have yet to determine the exact mechanism by which these cells produce these claws, so to speak, at such an abnormally rapid pace, but at this time, I hypothesize that it is the result of the victim's greatly increased metabolism. In my own observations, however, I have noted that infected individuals rarely use these claws to dismember their victims, relying instead on their mouth full of razor-like teeth to inflict mortal wounds, though they can certainly cause deep lacerations during an attack. Additionally, it has been reported that wendigo have been glimpsed climbing through trees and even along walls, a feat likely made possible by these strengthened and elongated nails. Indeed, perhaps the most viscerally disturbing aspect of the wendigo biology is its seemingly enlarged mouth, from which protrude a staggering number of sharp teeth, formed in what appears to be a completely random arrangement. In fact, the teeth of a PAV victim are grotesquely elongated by a process very similar to what I have previously described in both vampires and lichens. In short, the virus appears to trigger new amelogenesis, and additional enamel is formed on top of existing teeth by proliferating ameloblasts derived from the epithelial cells of the dental papilla. Traveling through the dentinal tubules towards the tooth's crown, the ameloblasts appear to secrete an additional extracellular matrix composed of enamel proteins and minerals. Though this process occurs rapidly, at least by normal standards, it is still quite slow, taking up to 3 weeks to form the sharp teeth seen in late-stage victims of the virus. Just as obvious, however, is the misshapen and misaligned appearance of the wendigo dentition. This is likely due to a combination of factors, the first of which is simple. In their unrelenting hunger, victims of PAV often attempt to consume matter which is far too solid to be broken down easily, such as frozen bone. As a result, trauma to the underlying jawbones can cause irregular healing patterns. Now, unlike lycanthropy, odontogenesis, or the formation of new teeth, may or may not be triggered in a PAV victim. When hyperdontia, or the growth of supplemental supernumerary teeth, does occur, it does so without the benefit of an elongated jaw as we see in lichens. As a result, for a certain number of PAV victims, the teeth become severely overcrowded, leading to a truly gruesome appearance. Finally, their unusual dentition is often due in part to abnormal growth in the alveolar processes of both the maxilla and mandible, likely a side effect of the increased growth hormone and insulin-like growth factor responsible for the widespread changes throughout the rest of the skeleton. This growth can actually lead to tooth loss, though this appears to be rare and does little to diminish a wendigo's fierce lethality. On a related note, I have observed that wendigo often exhibit torn and tattered flesh around their mouth. This is due in part to the unnatural length and crowding of the teeth within. But disturbingly, it is also due to the victim's unnatural hunger, which often causes them to gnaw at their own cheeks. So far, we've discussed many aspects of wendigo anatomy, but it should be noted that changes occur not only in the body, but in the mind as well. The chronically increased levels of stress hormones, paired with a cascade of broken feedback loops resulting in unregulated and painful hunger cues, will take their toll on even the strongest of wills. And because these hormonal changes occur relatively early in the process of viral reactivation, the mind tends to deteriorate before the body exhibits its extreme alterations. In more modern times, some have called this affliction wendigo psychosis. I am not a psychologist, however, and I do not claim to possess clear insight as to the reasonableness of this retroactive diagnosis. What I can say is that late-stage victims of PAV lose all semblance of virtue. They consume without conscience. However, higher levels of cognition may remain for some time, and though I have not observed this for myself, it is conceivable that a wendigo may speak with its victims or even play sadistic games with them before acting on their biological imperative to eat. Even still, my mind recoils at the thought. At this point, my valued listener, you may be wondering, even with these anatomical enhancements, how can a being with average human strength and intelligence be such an effective predator? The foremost reason has to do with their method of hunting. Rather than relying on sheer force or great speed, wendigo often lure their victims unsuspecting to their death. Legends frequently tell of unwitting travelers, perhaps lost in the wilderness, whose companions have gone missing in the cold. Suddenly, they hear a call in the distance from a friend or loved one they thought lost. They move toward the sound, calling back, relief filling their voice. Eventually, they reach the source of the voice, only to find nothing more than desolate forest. It is then, when their target is confused, tired, and often disoriented, that the wendigo strikes. This method of lure and ambush is highly effective, but how exactly can a wendigo create sounds capable of fooling their victims into chasing after it? Interestingly, the bodies of those infected with PAV undergo numerous changes to facilitate a heightened ability to mimic sounds, and then to project them over long distance. First, the virus appears to initiate proliferation of branches of the recurrent laryngeal nerve, itself a branch of the vagus nerve described earlier. As the name implies, the laryngeal nerve innervates the larynx, as well as several muscles which surround it, including the thyroarynoid and the lateral cricoarynoid. In particular, these muscles, which appear hypertrophied in victims I have studied, adduct the vocal cords with far more strength than in normal humans, creating unnaturally loud vocalizations. In fact, there are occasional reports of a wendigo's shriek over overcoming victims with their volume alone. But there is more to these vocalizations than mere decibel count, particularly as a result of the increased innervation of the thyroarytenoid. This allows for extraordinarily precise control of the vocal cords, allowing a wendigo to mimic vocal patterns across an uncanny range. Even more astoundingly, this ability is paired with what appears to be increased neural density in the left inferior parietal lobe, and specifically the left supramarginal gyrus, areas of the brain largely responsible for speech recognition and vocal reproduction efficiency. Late-stage victims of PAV exhibit exceptional access, storage, and retrieval capacity of auditory episodic events, detailed phonetic representation and phonemic awareness, and finally, generally exhibit a well-developed oromotor system, even though their articulation capacity is often reduced due to their dentition. In short, their enhanced vocal musculature and specific brain capacity makes them remarkably good at reproducing vocalizations they've encountered at nearly any point in the past. This ability is so advanced that I can confidently warn you, my dear listener, if ever you happen to find yourself lost in a frigid northern forest, never trust what you hear. We need help, need help, need help. We've spent a significant amount of time together, and I thank you for listening this far. I realize that there are many aspects of wendigo biology that appear to have been omitted from this presentation, but often what we expect and what we find in reality are two very different things. One common conception I would like to dispel outright is that of the wendigo's appearance in popular media. Many illustrations and descriptions depict a large, antlered, humanoid deer of some kind, or perhaps a gargantuan demon. These depictions, while certainly impressive in their own right, are in no way representative of the original legends, nor of those affected by PAV. Instead, they are inspired from books and films that took great liberties with their source material. Indeed, these animalistic depictions can even obscure the wendigo's true place in Algonquin culture. And whether you take my studies and observations as truth or not, it's difficult to deny that the spirit of the wendigo is very real. As Ojibwe author Basil H. Johnston states, the wendigo exemplifies human nature's tendency to indulge its self-interests, which, once indulged, demand even greater indulgence and ultimately result in the extreme, the erosion of principles and values. Given modern convenience and luxury, agonizing life and death decisions are, blessedly, no longer as commonplace, at least not in many of our relatively privileged lives. But while the threat of PAV may not be as prevalent as it once was, the spirit of the lonely places still haunts us today. This video was a work of fiction, and sources for all material and research can be found in the description. And as always, thanks for watching, and remember, you matter.